Let's apply this idea of natural selection to a classic examples. Why do giraffes have such a long neck and such long legs? So, to understand that, we need to know the environment in which giraffes live. Giraffes live in the African savanna. That means a place where there are lots of there is a lot of grass and a few relatively tall trees. Now, giraffes typically eat leaves of tree, and as you see at this photo, well, it's good that they have a long neck because, otherwise it's difficult to eat the leaves of such a tall tree. Now, giraffes have not always had such a long neck. So what would have changed? So let's imagine that there is some ancestor of the giraffe that was still some kind of an antelope-like animal that was eating small bushes close to the ground. But then, of course, there are not that many bushes in the savanna, and if there are a lot of these proto-giraffes, or these antelope-like creatures, after a while these bushes will all be eaten and there wouldn't be many leaves on them. So assume that among these proto-giraffes, some of them are a little bit taller than the others. The taller ones could eat the low bushes, but they could also eat bushes that were just a little bit taller than the others, which means in periods of starvation where there would be little to eat, it's the ones with the longest neck that were most likely to survive because they could still get a little bit more food than the ones that had a shorter neck. So each generation, each giraffe has offspring, different children, baby giraffes. Some of these giraffes would be a little bit taller, some would be a little bit less tall. On average, the taller ones would just get a little bit more food than the less tall ones, which means they were less likely to die, which means that if you go generation after generation, the giraffes tend to get taller and taller until you have these very tall giraffes that we know now. So that explains how giraffes have gotten their long neck. But that depends on the environment. So imagine that some other descendants of this creature were living in a region where there were no tall trees, where there were only small bushes. Well, that would not have evolved to have a long neck. So after enough generations, say after 100 or 500 generations, these kind of creatures that eat small bushes and these kind of creatures that eat tall trees, they would no longer be able to cross. You cannot have sex between this creature and this creature. They are too different. What does that mean? In biology, you consider that two animals belong to two different species if they cannot cross, if there are no intermediate forms. So that's why Darwin called his book On the Origin of Species. His idea is, why are there so many species of plants and animals? Because at a certain moment, two closely related plants or animals diverged enough so that they would no longer crossbreed, and then you have, by definition, two different species. So that means that natural selection depends on the environment. In certain environments, it's good to have a long neck. In other environments, it's good to be short and close to the ground, and that's why now there are antelopes that are eating mostly grass, and there are giraffes that are eating mostly from tall trees, and those have separated. So let's now generalize this mechanism. So what is the mechanism of evolution according to Darwin? First, you need to have a variation. So that is one of the most important concepts also in this course, variation. And then you have selection. Variation means that you should be able to produce a variety of different plants or animals. That means all the offspring of a particular giraffe will not all be the same. What creates a variation in biology? Two mechanisms. On the one hand, mutations. That means that the genes consists of certain codons. Sometimes a small error is made in copying the genes, and that error means that the new genes will be a little bit different from the old one. Second mechanism, recombination. Sexual reproduction means that you need a father and a mother. That means you take half of the genes of the mother, half of the genes of the father, you mix them, and you get a new offspring. But because, of course, each of the children will have another half from father and mother, so each of the offspring, all the siblings, the brothers and sisters, they will all be a little bit different. So that's the mechanism of variation. Variation means that you start with a population of plants or animals that are not exactly the same. They are similar, but they are not the same. And then the second part is a selection of all those different ones. Some will be better at surviving in the given environment, some will be less good. So you keep the ones that are better, you eliminate the ones that are less good, and that you have the basic ingredient. Those two things together, variation followed by selection, is the elementary step of evolution according to the mechanism of Darwin. That is a very simple method. Another way to express it is trial and error. Variation means you try out different combinations of genes. Error is some of those will not work as well as the others. You eliminate the errors, and whatever you keep, that's what you select. You eliminate what doesn't work well, you keep what works better. That you simply repeat. It's a very simple procedure, but you repeat it, you repeat it, you repeat it, generation after generation, and if you do that long enough, you get all the variety and all the complexity of all the different plants and animals. So we will discuss that mechanism in lots of details in different cases. Originally, it was proposed in biology by Darwin to explain, as he called it, the origin of species. Since then, the idea has just spread over practically all the sciences. The same Daniel Dennett that I cited as calling Darwin natural selection the best idea anybody ever had, he also called that idea a universal acid, by which he meant that you cannot contain it. You cannot keep it locked in some container. Whatever container you pour it in, the idea seeps out and spreads and spreads and spreads. And that's what we have seen in science since Darwin. This idea of natural selection has spread from biology to practically all the sciences. So I'll just give you some examples of that. I mean, there are thousands and millions of examples where this idea of natural selection has been applied, but let's start with some classical ones. One domain is called evolutionary psychology. So the idea is our body obviously is the result of biological evolution. Our body is adapted for certain functions, but the same applies to our mind, because our mind, after all, it's a brain that has been selected to function well in a particular environment. That means that the mechanisms of our brain, if we want to understand why we have, for example, certain emotions, we have to look at the evolution of humans, and we can see that, for example, certain emotions were particularly useful. I'll give another example than in the lecture notes, the emotion of disgust. Disgust, what is that? You're confronted with something like a vomit or snot or excrements, and you say, bah, and you stay far away from it. You don't want to touch it. It's a very strong instinctive repulsion that you have. Why is that? Why do you feel disgust for vomit and, for example, not for lettuce? Well, because evolutionarily, if somebody vomits, it's probably that they are ill. If they are ill, then probably there are infectious bacteria. They vomit them out. If you would somehow get some of that vomit into you, those bacteria would infect you, which means you might not survive it. So natural selection has made sure that whenever we smell or see vomit, we feel so disgusted that we stay very far away from it, and that we certainly don't want to touch it. Because all those who did not have that instinct of disgust, well, they might have touched the vomit and maybe even done like that, and they would have gotten ill, and they might not have survived it. So that's an example, but you can explain practically all emotions, practically all instinctive habits of people in that way. You can always find a reason why, at a certain moment, having that particular type of emotion would have made it more likely that you would survive and reproduce. People have even been applying it to the way we reason. There is now a very big study domain called cognitive biases. That means people typically do not reason logically. They have certain biases. That means assumptions that they make that are not always correct. Well, most of these biases, actually you can see that in practical circumstances they might have led people to quickly come to the conclusion, even if that conclusion is not logically justified. It's a conclusion that was more likely to be right than wrong in a situation where you had to make an important decision. For example, we have a so-called negativity bias. That means that our brain is much more sensitive for danger and for bad news than for good news or for opportunities. Why is that? Well, if you ignore a danger, you might not survive it. If you ignore an opportunity, well, it's a pity, but it's not the end of the world. So that's why we are much more sensitive to signs of dangers, things going wrong, than to signs of things going right. And unfortunately, that also leads to the fact that at the moment, for example, that's what you will mostly hear on the news. It's bad news, because bad news, by definition, attracts your attention. The negativity in the bias makes that people will pay much more attention to bad news than to good news. Another application of Darwinian thinking outside of biology is in sociology. There is a domain called sociobiology, which is about the evolution of social organizations, which we find in humans, but we also find it in quite a few other animal species. The most famous examples of social species are the so-called social insects, ants, termites, bees, that live together in very big colonies. And these colonies are almost what they call superorganisms. That means that one bee colony almost is so well coordinated, they almost act as if they are a single organism. So if, for example, a bee colony is attacked by, let's say, a predator, by, say, a bear that wants to eat the honey, the bees will attack that bear, but bees, when they sting, they die. Because stinging for a bee, the sting is part of their body. If it's removed from the body, the bee dies. So those bees that attack the bear, they're actually committing suicide for the survival of the nest. So these are the kind of things that evolutionary reasoning can explain. Why is that? Because in a bee nest, what is the thing that makes it a bee nest survives? It's the queen bee, because the queen bee is the one that lays the eggs. The other bees are so-called worker bees. They are sterile. They don't produce offspring. So for the queen bee to survive, she needs to be protected by the worker bees, and the worker bees should give their life for the queen bee, because if the worker bee dies, the colony can still produce new worker bees. If the queen dies, the colony is finished. All the worker bees will die because they cannot reproduce themselves. Another example for which I have a picture are vampire bats. Now, at first sight, vampire bats, these are in the sorts of stage, but with respect to the other bats, they are quite nice, because the problem with vampire bats is they need to find a good victim, which means typically some big animal, and if they manage to sneak up on the animal while it's asleep and they can suck blood, they can immediately suck a lot of blood. But if they don't find such an animal, they come back home, they live in caves, they come back to the cave when they're hungry and they don't have any food. So what have these vampire bats evolved to solve that problem? They have evolved a solidarity mechanism, which is that neighboring bats that are living together in the cave. If one bat was successful and was able to suck a lot of blood, it will regurgitate some of that blood to feed its companion, to feed another neighboring bat. So these bats are a social species that help each other. When the one is lucky and the other one is unlucky, the lucky one will help the unlucky one. Another example where Darwinian thinking is very useful is in medicine. There is a domain called Darwinian medicine or evolutionary medicine. Again, we know what is medicine about. Medicine is about diseases that we can have in our body. To understand why these diseases happen, we need to understand the biology of our body, but we also need to understand the biology of the parasites that make us ill. Viruses, bacteria make us ill, and there is a kind of a fight. Our body wants to survive the virus infection, and the immune system will try to fight the viruses. But the viruses want to spread because the viruses are also undergoing natural selection. The viruses are undergoing natural selection for the ability to infect as many people as possible. So what is the result of these two contradictory forces? So our body doesn't want to be ill and wants to subdue the viruses. The viruses want to infect as many people as possible. Well, what are the most successful viruses? These are the viruses that don't make people too ill. Typically cold viruses. What's typical of a cold virus? If you have a cold, you usually don't stay home. You usually still go out or go to the course, but occasionally you may sneeze. And when you sneeze, you spread a lot of viruses in the air, which somebody else can then inhale and catch the cold virus from you. So that's a strategy that viruses have developed. The most successful viruses are the ones that don't make you so ill that you stay home. They are the kind of viruses that allow you to infect other people. Another example of a much worse virus is the AIDS virus. What's typical about the AIDS virus is, yes, it can kill you, but only after a long time. The people who have AIDS and don't get the right treatment, after 10 years or so, they will probably die. But during these 10 years, they can still infect lots of people because they don't immediately understand that they are ill. And AIDS viruses are typically transmitted via sex. So if you have the AIDS viruses and you're not feeling too ill and you're still having sex with people, you're transmitting the AIDS virus. Let's take another example, the Ebola virus, something that everybody's very much afraid of because it's a very horrible disease. It kills you very quickly, but Ebola is unlikely to infect many people precisely because it kills people too quickly. These people don't have the occasion to infect many other things. So that's one of the examples of how you can apply evolutionary reasoning to understand the spread of diseases. You can also use evolutionary reason to understand the immunity or lack of immunity of our body. So our body needed to develop defense mechanisms against common problems. Let's take an example of something that's known to be very toxic, dioxin. Now, dioxins, people are rightly afraid of dioxins. They are very toxic, but actually they're not as toxic as you might think. If you do experiments with animals, you find that a very small amount of dioxins is enough to kill an animal. But people, strangely enough, are much more resistant to dioxins. How do we know? In 1976, there was a catastrophe in an Italian village of Seveso. A factory exploded, and in that factory there were large amounts of dioxins. These dioxins were spread all over the countryside and the city. And as you see on the picture, all the animals died, and some of the children got these kind of eruptions on their skin, which were pretty nasty, but they didn't die. So why is that all the animals died and no people died? Apparently people are more immune to dioxins than animals. Why could that be? Well, dioxins are actually part of the smoke that is produced if you burn wood. And people have been using fire for probably at least 1 million years, which means that our ancestors have been inhaling quite a lot of wood smoke. And those genes that were not very resistant against the dioxins in that wood smoke have probably been eliminated, and the people that remain are probably much more resistant to dioxins than animals who never had contact with wood smoke. These are still applications of evolutionary thinking that in the core are about biology. When I speak about medicine, speaking about our bodies or about parasites. When I'm speaking about biology, I'm speaking about our brain, which is part of our biology. When I'm speaking about social insects, still in the realm of biology, but the idea of natural selection can also be applied to things that are not biological. And one clear example is economics. In a capitalist system, you have a lot of competition. You have all kinds of different companies that try to survive by selling things and making profit. In order to make profit, they need to find the right resources, and they need to have a public. There need to be demand for their product. That means people need to be sufficiently interested to want to buy their product or their services. Now, not all companies are as good at that, and in fact, most companies sooner or later go bankrupt and they disappear. So we regularly read about the failure rates of companies. Most companies simply do not survive, which means that we have the same kind of natural selection at the level of businesses that we have at the level of organisms, and it's only the best companies, that means those that manage to sell the product that most people want to have. There's another concept from evolution that we will discuss later in more detail. It's the concept of a niche. A niche means that you find a particular environment in which you get all the resources you need, and there isn't much competition. So what's typically a company that's doing well? It's a company that's found a niche. That means it has found some particular product or service for which there aren't many competitors, and at which they are particularly good at providing that service. If you have such a company, you will make a lot of money, the company will grow, the company may be imitated by others. So it's as if the company has offspring, the ideas of the company are picked up, and like that they spread. That brings me to the next application of evolutionary thinking, that is culture. So what is culture? Culture are ideas, beliefs, knowledge, habits that are transmitted from person to person, so that they become a common good within the group. So, for example, language is part of our culture. Everybody who speaks a particular language has somehow learned it from other people. Languages are not things invented by people. They are things that are shared and transmitted from the one to the other. But now, we are constantly confronted with cultural items. For example, if you open your social media page, you will get lots of different announcements, jokes, ideas, pictures, songs, etc. Some of those you will not even look at. Some of those you may look at and immediately forget. Some of those you will find so good that you send them on and you share them with your friends. That's again an example of selection. The variation of all these different messages that are on your social media feed, most of those, they disappear, you forget about them. A few you will remember and you will propagate, you will pass on to others. Now, I have done a lot of research in memetics, and the original meaning of the word meme is not what it has become now as a kind of a joke. A meme in general is an item of culture that is copied and replicated. So meme was originally proposed by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins as an equivalent to gene. Just like genes are being copied when an animal produces offspring, it passes on its genes. A meme is a culture that is being, whenever there's a joke that like and you put on to friends, it's a meme that is reproducing. But it doesn't need to be a joke. It can be some theory, some experiment, it can be a conspiracy theory, it can be a religious belief, it can be a bit of scientific news. Anything that is passed on one person to another is a meme, and most memes die out. They are eliminated. They are almost immediately forgotten. A few from what's called the whole world hears about it.
Is a meme a category within culture, or is it?
Well, a meme is a unit culture, and it's a bit controversial because lots of people will say a culture is not really subdividable in units, but that's not really a good argument in the sense that you can always subdivide to some degree, just like you can subdivide a text into sections and into paragraphs, into sentences and into words and into letters. You can subdivide a culture into ideas, beliefs, habits, and yeah, depends how much you will go to subdivide. If you subdivide a text into letters, you cannot say that letters individually reproduce. Words also don't reproduce, but sometimes a single sentence is a particularly good sentence, like the quote I took from Daniel Dennett. It becomes a meme, like the single best idea anybody ever had. It's a phrase that is good enough that you may remember it, and maybe you will tell that to somebody else, like natural selection is the single best idea anybody ever had. So that's an example of a meme. Natural selection itself, it's a meme. Natural selection, those two terms in that combination, it's a very good meme. Most people in the world have heard about it. Many may not understand it, but most people at least have heard that term. So what makes that memes are successful or are fit? That's another term that we will discuss in much more detail. Natural selection is also sometimes called survival of the fittest. Fit means being able to survive and reproduce in a given environment. So a fit meme or a fit organism is one that is successful in surviving and multiplying. What's a fit meme? Let's take a joke. Well, some jokes are much better than others. What are some of the criteria for a fit meme? Well, I've done research about it and I've made a list of criteria, but here I stick to a simpler version that was proposed by some colleagues of mine, and they speak about the success criterion. S-U-C-C-E-S. Imagine some story that appears on your social media page. When are you likely to find that story interesting enough to pass it on to others? To start, it should ideally be simple. If it's too complicated, you may not understand, you will not remember. It should be unexpected, something surprising, something out of the ordinary. If it's just the usual stuff, you're unlikely to remember. It should ideally be concrete, not some abstract reflections, but very concrete, something that happened to a particular person on a particular date. It should be credible, that means you wouldn't pass on things that you don't yourself. ideally it should be emotional. That means it makes you angry, or it frightens you, or it makes you laugh, if it excites some emotion. And a good story. So simple, unexpected, concrete, credible emotional stories. That's one recipe for a good meme. If your story has these characteristics, it's much more likely to spread. So, some examples of memes. The fact that the meme spreads does not mean that it is true or that it is in any way useful. There is, for example, a well-known meme, so-called the Mozart effect. Probably some of you have heard, said that if you play classical music, and especially Mozart, to babies, then the babies will grow up to be more intelligent. It's what sometimes called an urban legend. There is no scientific evidence for that. Now, the same people that formulated the success criteria, they also looked at the origin of that meme. What they found was that maybe 30 years ago, there was a scientific paper that said something that they had done experiments where they had let people solve some complicated tasks, and first they had played classical music for some of them and not for others. And it turned out that the ones that had listened to the classical music were better at solving those puzzles than others. Maybe because they were more relaxed, or maybe their brainwaves were more in tune. But anyway, that was a whole thing. So that has been reported by journalists who were quoting each other, and obviously the meme has evolved from this story about adults solving puzzles and listening to music. It evolved into babies listening to Mozart and developing a higher IQ, which of course is a stronger statement than what actually happened. But typically, again, an example of natural selection. The story becomes simpler, it becomes more unexpected, it becomes more witty, it becomes emotional. If it's something about babies, it's already more emotional than if it's just about adults, and if it's about making those babies permanently more intelligent, that will much more stir your emotion and be much more unexpected. If it's just about adults being more relaxed and therefore being better at solving puzzles. So that's a way to apply this to culture. There's another example. One of my former colleagues at the Center, Lian Gabor, wrote the first computer simulation of memetic evolution. So what she did was she programmed so-called agents. We will speak later about that in more detail. Where these agents had neighbors, and either they could build something on their own, or they could imitate neighbors, but the reason that they had 8 neighbors and would choose the one that had the best solution. So all these agents had to solve a problem. So what the problem is, they could either, by a trial and error, for themselves try to find a solution, or they could imitate the best solution from their neighbors. So there are 2 extreme cases. Either everybody tries by trial and error to find the best solution. And in that case, yeah, it's not going to be very efficient because they all have to start again from scratch. On the other hand, if they would all imitate, the neighbors will never improve, because whatever solution was to be imitated, everybody would just continue imitating it. She found in simulation that it worked best if 10% of the agents would be trying themselves to solve the problems, and 90% of the agents would imitate the others. That combination apparently gives the overall results that they had. And that is typically also what you see in a culture. There are relatively few creative people who come up with new ideas. Most people will just imitate and see, who has a good approach to that? Okay, I'll do it like that. So that shows that these ideas of evolution level of memes, they can also be used to help understand how ideas spread. Computing. There's a method in computing called a genetic algorithm, and genetic here means really the genes do. So what do genes do? I said that in sexual reproduction, what happens is that half of the genes of the mother, half of the genes of the father are used, but don't know which half. So what happens is that, let me see. Let's say that each color are different types of genes. And now you come to in the second generation. Here you take the first 4 from the green one and the last 2 from the blue one, and you create a new version. Or you can do the opposite. You can take the first 4 from the blue one and the last 2 from the green one. You can do the same with the yellow and the purple ones. Here you take those 2 yellow ones and keep the rest purple, or you can do it vice versa. So which means you create new generations. What are these things? They are potential solutions to some problem. Doesn't matter what the problem is. You can represent a solution as a list of symbols. The symbols could be ones and zeros, or they could be letters, or they could be numbers, doesn't matter. You represent possible solutions as lists, or sometimes you do mutation. That means that you randomly select one of them and change it by something else. And then, after the variation step, you do selection. That means from all the different potential solutions that are generated, you choose the best ones. And with these best ones, you repeat the procedure. You do crossover, you do mutation, that means you do variation. You again keep the best one, and like that you just repeat. And that's a method that, for some domains, works very well and allows the computer to find solutions to very complex problems where you don't really know where to start. So that is called evolutionary computation or genetic algorithms. It's again the same principle. You start with something that is not bad, you make variations of it, you test whether those variations are better or worse, you keep the better ones, you throw away the worse ones, and you repeat, and you repeat, and you repeat. And since computers are fast, they can do that for thousands and millions of generations. And in the end, you may come up with something that's much better than anybody could have thought of by reflecting logically. Last example, chemistry. What's the difficulty in chemistry? You need to find a molecule that will have certain properties. For example, you may want to develop a glue. That means that you need to have a particular molecule that sticks to particular types of surfaces. And let's say you want to have a glue that works specifically good on glass or on aluminium or whatever. Yeah, it's not obvious which molecules have these properties. So one way to do it is you generate a variety of molecules and you just test them, and you see that some of these molecules will stick to the surface, and others will wash off. And so now you can repeat that. You keep the ones that stick more or less. You produce somehow variations of these molecules. Some of them will stick better, some of them will stick less well. You again keep the best ones, and like that you can repeat. Now, in chemistry, that's not applied that often, but in pharmacy, where you need very specific complex molecules to, for example, to fit in certain receptors in the body. For example, our brains or our intestines have particular receptors for particular types of molecules. For example, suppose you want to develop a new kind of painkiller. Well, there are certain receptors for signaling molecules. If these receptors get the signal, they may interpret it as pain. Maybe you want to create a molecule that will stop these receptors from taking up these molecules, so you will need to have some kind of a different molecule that will block the receptor. These molecules typically have very complicated shapes. You can't generally calculate what's the ideal molecule, but you can again use this kind of evolutionary approach, generate a lot of variations, see what works best, keep what works best, repeat. So, in conclusion, the evolutionary approach is an enormously powerful way of looking at lots of different problems. That's why Daniel Dennett called it the best idea anybody ever had. But it would be good if the problem was solved with that. Well, it's not enough. Principle of natural selection is a very good start, but it's not enough. So what is still lacking in this Darwinian approach? Well, we spoke about reductionism. The Newtonian worldview is reductionist. That means it reduces complex things to simple components, simple elements. We just had the example with culture. You were asking me what's the difference between culture and meme. Well, a meme is an element of culture. So one of the criticisms of the memetic approach is to say, well, you can't really reduce a culture to a collection of memes. And that criticism is to some degree correct. It does not mean that it's not useful to look at individual memes, but looking at individual memes is not enough. You can specify why a particular belief may propagate well, but that belief typically will be part of a much wider worldview, a religion, an ideology, and splitting it up in its components can teach you some things, but other things you wouldn't understand. So that's the problem. The Darwinian worldview, purely Darwinian worldview, tends to look for specific components. In the original version of Darwin, it's individual organisms. In the more modern, what is called the neo-Darwinian biology, the elements are genes. So we are looking at the variation and selection of the individuals. The individual are means. Yeah, an organism is more than a collection of genes. An ecosystem is more than a collection of organisms. There is something like a system. There is something like a whole that's more than the sum of them. So that will be the next topic of the next chapter, where we need to look at both the elements and the environment as more than just collection of them. That will be for the next
Said that doesn't really provide at all but doesn't cite also describing things where the principle is able to predict, but it doesn't really have a one.
Shows how complex things from simple things. Which means if you go backwards, you get the simple things, and then there is not any more. That's the entire one.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Wat de antwoord wil van mijn vraag.
Questions. So could we use the same idea of evolution in, for example, GPT, the general pre-trained transformator? Because the transformator could be seen as the cheat, the pre-trained could be seen as the previous selection, and the general just yeah, that's
those things that are successful
get
stronger,
back, yeah.
so they get a bigger impact. The ones that are less successful are weaker.
Yeah, I supposed to go meet somebody in an hour.
And for the
Let me
Darwinian
just
economics,
finish
if
this.
I'm not wrong,
We
we
backing this
also
up.
made a theory
That could be